From the Cayman Islands perspective, we think is very timely and very important. Whilst I am the current chairman of UCOTA, the UK Overseas Territories Association, I am here as the Cayman Islands representative. So I just wanted to clarify that. I think what sets, to answer the question, I think the similarity between all of the overseas territories, one is that we all are British, and we're all British by choice. Obviously, the Caribbean region has 5 British overseas territories, and whilst some have similar histories, I guess the main thing that brings us all together is that we share the same environmental opportunities and challenges. But as it relates to culture and our own history and perhaps where we're going, it's all very individual.
Dr. Clegg.
Yes, I would say I think constitutionally there are significant similarities across the 5 territories. I think the Caribbean region is an interesting nexus, which perhaps we can talk about later in terms of what support going forward various organisations within the Caribbean can provide the OTs. I think economically, of course, there is diversity and distinctiveness in terms of offshore finance, in terms of tourism, in terms of construction. There are similarities there too. And some of the issues which Mr. Bryant touched upon in terms of the nature of these societies and some of the tensions within them, I think is another interesting common factor across many of the territories too.
Would those factors be what make Caribbean territories tend to be anyway, wealthier than others?
I think in part. Somebody said a while ago, American money and British security were very important for the territories. Things have moved on a bit since then. But I think that balance in terms of significant degree of economic sort of autonomy, but with that sort of British security, political and defence security are important, and that's good balance in terms of international investors, for example, thinking about the territories, having that balance and knowing that English common law and other aspects of the British presence apply.
Certainly with the Cayman Islands, our economy is tied very closely to the United States, not least because of the geography, being 500 miles directly south of Miami. Tourism is heavily focused on the United States because of the proximity and the direct access, and also our global financial services. The majority of our business is through the US.
Would you say that the security provided both by the United Kingdom, thanks very much, the security provided by the United Kingdom, both in sort of physical terms but also in political ones, in the sense of, as you put it, Dr. Clegg, a sort of a structured and formal political system that is less prone to failure than some of your non-overseas territories' neighbours. Do you think that is one of the strengthening factors as well?
Well, from the Cayman Islands perspective, we appreciate the constitutional relationship between the UK and the Cayman Islands. 60 years ago, next year, we'll celebrate the 60 years of the direct constitutional relationship between the UK and the Cayman Islands, because prior to that we were administered in a parish of Jamaica, the colony of Jamaica. But as Jamaica decided to go independent, Cayman made the conscious decision to remain British rather than going independent ourselves or remaining a part of Jamaica. And since then, since July 1959 up till now, we appreciate the constitutional relationship that we have. And that being said, as that has evolved and devolved administration has taken place, the UK has retained the responsibility of external affairs, defence and internal security, and that works well for us.
I would agree, and I think it's sometimes, of course, the British government has to get involved much more directly, as in the case of the Turks and Caicos Islands. But beyond that sort of high level, I think just having the British presence there is an additional set of checks and balances in terms of what can go on within the local political structure.
And what would you say are the risks to this political stability and economic success?
I think, of course, the environmental situation is perhaps increasingly difficult for many of the territories, certainly in the Eastern Caribbean, so that is a significant challenge, both short-term and longer-term. I think with Brexit, the lack of engagement possibly with the European Union in relation to offshore finance can be a challenge too. And I think more general quest, I know some of the territories are happy with their balance of their economies, but some are looking at sort of new opportunities, and whether those new opportunities could be fully exploited within the context of, you know, the direct link with the United Kingdom rather than a more broad link across the European Union.
For the Cayman Islands specifically, we have been, if you will, left our own devices on creating our own economy, whether it be for tourism, whether it be for regional and global healthcare, attracting people for health tourism, or for global financial services, which we adhere to all the global standards and meet or exceed. I think the risk comes in not least with the realities of Brexit. As I said before, the UK does retain responsibility for external relations and external affairs for the Cayman Islands. I think it's safe to say that with the realities of Brexit, that the UK is, for the foreseeable future, is going to be more concerned about their own external affairs and if you will, creating its own independent, excuse the term, independent international identity and focusing on that, and rightfully so. So for the Cayman Islands, the risk for us is that we need to be more proactive and in assistance, with assistance by the UK government, trying to form our own international identity.
Andrew, do you want to? Thank you, Mr. Bush, I was very impressed by the detailed submission you sent to the committee. It's particularly interested to see how clear you are about the British identity of Cayman. You talk about the relationship with the British Crown, the Union flag, British citizenship, strong supporters of the monarchy and sovereignty. So essentially you're basically saying you're as British as the rest of us. So how do you feel about appearing today before the Foreign Affairs Committee? How does that fit?
Well, thank you, Mr. Rosendale. As we do say in the written submission, we are British. An earlier question, previous persons given evidence, the Cayman Islands was never colonised by the UK. We were actually formed, if you will, our history tells us that we were formed by two British men from Cromwell's army, one from Cornwall, one from Wales. So we were settled, if you will, by the British, and being British is within our DNA. It's who we are. There was another question around, well, what about the public display of being British? As you said, we fly Union Jack on our flag. The Queen is on our money. We drive on the left. We adhere to British common law. We are British by our very nature. Yes, we have a Caymanian identity. There's no getting away from that. But that does not take away from the foundation of being British.
So, apologies to members for returning to some of the points we discussed in the previous session. But as you are actually representing a territory today, do you feel it's time that the UK rebooted its relationship with British overseas territories to include them as equally British whilst defending their right of self-determination and the management and running their own constitutions and their own internal affairs? Is it not time their overseas territories were given a separate department, either the Cabinet Office or its own special unit within HMG that deals specifically with overseas territories? Mm-hmm. Also, do you feel it's time that the UK Parliament had a specialist select committee that deals, rather than it being fitted in with the general foreign affairs issues of the day, which there are huge amount that we have to deal with, should there not be a committee of Parliament that deals with all the territories of the Crown that are external to the United Kingdom, but for whom we have responsibilities and ultimate sovereignty?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. From the Cayman Islands perspective, we are happy overall with the constitutional relationship between the Cayman Islands and the UK. The way in which the relationship itself is managed, as we say in our written submission, we do think it is dated and could be reformed. If you look at the FCO's desk model, and as was said earlier on in the session, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is the UK government department that is responsible for, if you will, pushing and promoting the UK government's foreign policy. The Cayman Islands and indeed other overseas territories are not foreign.
So who's your foreign minister, by the way? Who decides your foreign policy?
Well, the UK government retains foreign policy for us, so,
Okay.
so Lord Ahmad would be the minister for the overseas territories.
So you have a minister elected by the UK citizens that decides your foreign policy, on your defence policy, and a lot of other things as well.
Well, he's a peer, but
Okay.
he's appointed as the,
by an elected government. That's
yes,
the point.
that's correct. And particularly about Lord Ahmad, I do want to say that the Cayman Islands and the Cayman Islands Premier and Lord Ahmad have a fantastic relationship. But that's individual to individual, whereby we believe now the structure can be reformed, because the system that is currently being used in the desk officer model of the Foreign Office is something that was used, as far as I'm aware, back in the day when you had the Colonial Office, whereby the Colonial Office was responsible for administering the actual colonies of the UK government. But as we now have more devolved administration within most of the overseas territories, we think that there could be a restructuring within the UK government system that is better framed to managing the relationship and administering and creating a conduit of communication, whether it be throughout Whitehall for the many different facets of the particular overseas territory, rather than in the FCO within the Overseas Territories Directorate, which uses a desk officer model, which is something that was used back in the colonial era.
So would you support changes such as I've outlined, that a separate department of government separate from the FCO, a dedicated committee in Parliament that deals with all issues relating to territories, that doesn't get mixed up with foreign affairs and international relations, and generally overseas territories being given a status which makes them equal within the British family and within the way the British Constitution operates?
Particularly in the context of Brexit and the real changes that will naturally bring and is bringing for the UK, and the new sense of a global Britain. Certainly from the Cayman Islands standpoint, we want to be a strong member of that global British family. There's evidence to show when things work very well. Not for us, earlier this year, we participated with the Department of International Trade as a member of the official delegation in the Great Festival of Innovation in Hong Kong. And the Secretary of State wrote to the Premier thanking him for Cayman's participation, because at that point in time we showed, if you will, a tangible benefit of how the Cayman Islands and what we bring to the table and what a global Britain looks like for the benefit of all concerned.
Can I just have one point in terms of issues around foreign affairs? So I think it's true for the Cayman Islands as well as the British Virgin Islands and Montserrat, that even though the governor has sort of ultimate authority, a lot of that authority has been devolved down to the territory governments. So particularly for countries like, or territories like Anguilla and Montserrat, where they're really embedded into that sort of regional structure, that local autonomy is quite useful.
Just one tiny little final question to Mr. Bush again, because it's representing a territory. How does it make you feel as someone who represents Caymanians who are, as you said, very loyal to the Crown, to the United Kingdom? Caymanians serve in Her Majesty's Armed Forces. How does it make you feel on Remembrance Sunday when nobody from the overseas territories actually lays a wreath on behalf of the territories? Why should the Foreign Secretary, be laying a wreath on behalf of the people of Cayman and all the territories around the world who actually proportionally have served more proportionally greater service in Her Majesty's Armed Forces than the UK does? Do you not think it's time that there was a change and there was recognition of what the territories have contributed to UK defence and during conflicts in that way?
I can certainly say that during Remembrance Day, we in Cayman celebrated ourselves, not celebrated, but commemorated
Yeah.
as well in a typical fashion. As the Cayman Islands representative, it's always been appreciated when we are included in ceremonial events like that really mean and really show that the Cayman Islands is a part of the British family.
So how does it make you feel that you can't lay a wreath? That's the point. Is it right, or you're happy with that situation?
No, we would love to be included. The Cayman Islands would love to be included in such a ceremony.
Okay, thank you.
Chris.
You might have to write to Buckingham Palace to get an answer on that one. The Constitution of 2009 of Cayman says that it is a country in which religion finds its expression in moral living. What does that mean?
Sorry, sir.
Your constitution in Cayman from 2009 says that Cayman is a place in which religion finds its expression in moral living. What does that mean?
Well, I'm not a constitutional expert, but I think it's quite plain in what it's trying to say. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be difficult. Are you asking me to legally define what that means?
Well, I'm trying to understand. You know, we don't have a constitution. We don't have a written constitution in the UK at all. But on the whole, that sounds like a rather different set of values to British set of values.
The Constitution of 2009 is as a result of long conversation between the UK government and the Cayman Islands government, and that is the product of mutual agreement.
So, but I'm trying to tease out why you would want to be British if you don't subscribe to British values. So, for instance, there's been a long battle about whether or not you should have same-sex marriage in Cayman. And you won't even recognise people's migrant rights for their spouses when they're already in a civil partnership or a same-sex relationship that's recognised in other authorities, unlike, for instance, Aruba.
I understand that. The issue of same-sex marriage is subject to legal challenge in the Cayman Islands currently, so it would be inappropriate for me to expand any further on that.
Why? Why would it be inappropriate?
That's what I'm submitting.
So you have no view about same-sex marriage in Cayman?
I am a civil servant, and it would be inappropriate for me to give an opinion on behalf of the Cayman Islands about any government policy.
Dr. Clegg.
Yes, it is certainly a problematic issue across the Caribbean, including within the overseas territories. It is something which is divergent from UK policy and approach in general. There are heated discussions, but there are certain actors within overseas territory societies and within the Caribbean more generally, including various church groups, who have fought and are fighting very strongly against any change to legislation. So I agree that across the territories in the Caribbean, certainly, it is a problematic issue when issues such as British values are considered. I agree, and maybe the judicial route is the way that things will start to change.
I mean, I fully get why an independent country would want, a fully independent country would want to, decide its own laws on marriage or whatever else. I would want to take part in that debate, maybe even, but that's neither here nor there. The bit that seems odd to me, and why I ask this question, is because it seems like having your cake and eat it, which is you want to be part of the British umbrella, but you don't want to be part of the British way of life.
I mean, of course, 10 years ago or so, an order in council was needed to change to decriminalise gay sex in the overseas territories.
Yeah.
So that's just an indication of how difficult this issue is for many within those societies. Now, it's possible the UK government would think that is an appropriate step to take in terms of imposing or implementing another order in council. But at the moment, the politics are very difficult within the overseas territories in the Caribbean. But these judicial cases may see some progress. But that is, an opportunity or an option for the government, to take that decision.
But it sort of strikes to the heart of self-determination, doesn't it?
Of course it
because
does.
we assert self-determination, for instance, against Argentina in relation to the Falklands, which I'm fully signed up to. But it's a bit of a pick-and-mix arrangement that we have. And at the moment it feels that the UK government is more in favour of hands-off. But Parliament, interestingly, in relation to financial services, this year has asserted that the overseas territories will provide financial transparency.
Again, it's sort of an issue in terms of the constitutional power, I guess. So the issues around Bermuda and same-sex marriage or civil partnerships, because Bermuda has greater constitutional autonomy, that was more difficult for perhaps the UK government to get involved with. But in the Caribbean territories, there is that right and authority, and it would be easier to do. It wouldn't be popular, it would certainly be controversial, but there would be that option for the United Kingdom government to take that route.
So in relation to the legislation that we passed in Parliament earlier this year on financial transparency and providing full for all of the overseas territories by a fixed date, which I can't remember when it is, what's the view in Cayman and the other overseas territories?
The government has been quite vocal in saying that we believe it amounts to constitutional overreach. The area of financial services and the way in which we legislate financial services is something that is devolved. The Cayman Islands has and will continue to adhere to and be an early adopter to all global standards, in which public registers is not a global standard. The Premier, as early as 2013, came to the UK and spoke in UK media, in hard talk in fact, and made it clear that the Cayman Islands would be an early adopter once, as and when this becomes a global standard.
So, but will you adhere to it then, even if it doesn't become a global standard, because it's British law and we've legislated for it, or not?
Well, this is something that, as you rightly say, it's until December 2020. So.
Yeah, sure.
And it's an important point to make. There's been big concern from various organisations. Global Witness estimated 34 billion of Russian funds had been invested in Caribbean overseas territories, and 30 billion of it in the British Virgin Islands. You're not here to speak for BVI, but nevertheless, and 110 billion, apparently, according to the Russian Central Bank and the IMF, has gone through Caribbean overseas territories in the last decade. We are, as a committee, we've been very exercised. We published a report a few months ago about Moscow's gold and the Russian corruption of society in British politics. We are, as a British Parliament, we've legislated, and I'm interested in your response, because you're almost implying that we won't set the highest standards, that in Cayman or other overseas territories you will wait until everybody in the world has signed up and then it becomes a global standard. That the British Parliament has, the sovereign British Parliament has legislated that we want to have higher standards than the lower standards which might be or might not be agreed by the rest of the world. Where do you stand on that debate?
Well, in this context, there are two international organizations that I think are relevant. One is the FATF and the other is the OECD. And they are the ones to set this global standard. So it's not, if you will, Sir Mr. Gates, that it's a bunch of countries. It's a global standard setting body that is there to set standards, but also hold countries to account and rate those countries. And certainly from those organizations, the Cayman Islands has always been on par with countries like the UK, the US, Australia, Germany, France. We have maintained those standards.
In the past, but the UK government has now raised the bar and said we're going to have a higher standard. My question is, are you choosing a lower standard, or are you going to go with the British government and our legislature in this country?
The Parliament, so the Act was accepted in Parliament. It is now primary UK legislation. It gives all overseas territories until the end of 2020 to adopt public registers. I will also say, I do have to say, that it did not look to legislate directly for the Crown dependencies, which perhaps is a different review. But I can't say what will happen.
The Prime Minister of the Cayman, Premier McLaughlin, is quoted as saying that Cayman would not sit quietly and accept the UK government's plans to impose a public register. Does that mean that your government is on a collision course with the British government and the British Parliament?
The Premier is the elected leader of the Cayman Islands. He and his government set government policy. I am here as the Cayman Islands representative and a civil servant. I am here to explain the Cayman perspective. You yourself read the quote, sir.
So you are on a collision course with the British government.
I can say we continue to have
Parliament.
constructive conversations with the UK government about the legislation and the overall relationship between the UK and the Cayman Islands.
And will you accept the legislation that we have passed in this Parliament?
It's not for me to say, Mr. Gage.
Okay.
I'm not trying. That's my limitation.
May I
Just-
come? Sorry,
Sorry,
go
can I
on,
just add a
Dr.
couple
Clegg,
of
go on.
quick bits of context? I think one issue is this is the first time on a financial matter that legislation has been passed in this way. So in the past it has been more collaborative. So, for example, looking back at the European Savings Tax Directive, for example, the frameworks for fiscal responsibility, there was a bit of a tussle, but ultimately the individual territories agreed before the UK government had to act more directly. So this is sort of a new territory, I guess, in some ways. And the relationship with the fact that the Crown dependencies haven't been asked to do the same thing has caused some reverberations within the territories. So the idea is between, crudely, white territories and black territories. Why are the black territories being focused and highlighted in this way? So that is an argument which certainly has been discussed in the British Virgin Islands as a source of contention within that context.
So are you saying to me that the British Virgin Islands would be very happy to carry on being a recipient of billions of dollars or rubles or tens of billions of rubles of questionable money and stand aside from what the UK government is now saying?
Well, I couldn't certainly speak for the British Virgin Islands, but there's the idea of double standards, I guess, on the part of the UK government as things stand at the moment.
Okay.
There is certainly an argument on that, and certainly some elements of the overseas territories registers seem to be rather better than the UK registers, and certainly in terms of identifying actual directors and checking genuine ownership. And it's clear, certainly to many of us, that there's a lot we could learn in reverse. There is, however, I think it's worth noting the reason that the change of attitude in the Parliament has come about this time, the reason that the vote went through this time in a way that it probably wouldn't have done in the past, is because this is in many ways not seen as a financial matter but a national security matter. Mr. Gabes has quite rightly highlighted various elements of illegal funding, of dirty money, if you will, that has gone through various jurisdictions, and I'm certainly not going to say that the United Kingdom is clean on this. That would be untrue. But the difference between the money going through in the past and the money going through now is that in the past it was by and large different forms of tax evasion in countries that frankly should keep control of their own jurisdictions. Today it's something else. Today it is money going through that is being used to corrupt allies around the world, to weaken our defensive alliances, to influence civil society in various different ways, and therefore this is no longer, though I understand the point that you're making, Mr. Bush, this is no longer a financial matter. This is a national security matter. And as you quite rightly said, our national security support to the Cayman Islands and others is part of the infrastructure that allows the prosperity of the Caymanian people, and this is an element of it. This is, from our perspective, this is fundamentally an element of it, and that's why this different action has been taken on this occasion. But can I perhaps, forgive me for having, but I think it's worth making that absolutely clear. Can I just ask very briefly, when we talk about national security like that, and when people see it like that, I do accept that there is the need for a conversation to go both ways. What aspects do you think that we could be more proactive on? And I ask this question because, of course, a lot of the cooperation from the Cayman Islands government and others is made on the basis of an offer. If you wish to investigate our records, you can do so, and you will get an answer within a certain time period on beneficial ownerships and other such things. How many times have those records been consulted in the past year, for example?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I don't have the exact figures. I would venture to say from the last report I've seen it was less than 40. It was less than 40 requests that was made and answered.
That doesn't surprise me, having spoken to other jurisdictions. The numbers are surprisingly low coming from the UK and asking these questions. And I think that is also a matter of concern, that our own jurisdictions are not using the facilities that you have made available.
I will also add that there is a common reporting standard whereby it does not address foreign nationals, but certainly UK nationals. So anyone who is a UK national that has an account, an interest, a business, a company registered in the Cayman Islands, that information is shared with the relevant authority once a year. So that's automatic exchange of information. But as specific information is needed by HMRC or in fact the National Crime Agency, then that information is provided within 24 hours, or if it's an emergency, within 1 hour.
Yeah, and that's the area where, frankly, and some supplementary requests would probably not go amiss.
And if I could just make two more points on to complement what you just said. First off, I think it's important to recognize that the Cayman Islands and the Cayman Islands government share in the goal of fighting against money laundering, tax evasion, terror financing, and overall corruption. We have the same goal. This is why it is important to acknowledge global entities like the OECD and the FATF that create these global standards. The way in which we do so and the way in which we cooperate, just like all good cooperation, it starts with constructive conversation. And that's where we think, certainly with the actions taken by Parliament in accepting the amendment in the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act now, if you will, betrayed years of constructive conversation, because even the exchange of notes that we had in 2016, which if you will, solidified the cooperation and put time frames of when the Cayman Islands would provide this information, what this information would be and how it would be used, etc. The lack of conversation, the lack of adequate information provided to Parliament, we think led to this act, led to a sense of frustration, which was obvious to see. But similarly, it was a sense from the Cayman side, a sense of disbelief. Why? What happened? Because there is a disconnect, and we think that that's where the management of the relationship comes in, and that's where I think is at the heart of this review of how the information is shared with the UK government and indeed Parliament.
Mike,
can I ask you mentioned discussions that are going on. Do you know what the British government is saying to your government about the steps that are necessary to be taken to implement the legislation?
I don't understand. Can you just reword? Sorry.
Do you have any knowledge of what discussions there are between the British government and the Cayman government about the implementation of this legislation by 2020?
I would say that the conversations continue between the cooperation and the relationship between the UK government and the Cayman Islands, not just in financial services, not just in the discussion around implementing public registers of beneficial ownership, but the conversation continues in many facets, sir.
Do you think it will be necessary for the British government to implement these measures unilaterally via order in council or some other mechanism?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that, sir.
Perhaps Dr. Clegg, have you got a view?
I mean, that is, of course, an option for the UK government to do, and it may be possible. But as I said before, when there have been similar circumstances, at the end, there has been compromise between the British government and the governments of the overseas territories. But I'd just say one other thing more broadly. I think one issue is about the capacity of regulating offshore finance as well. So there are concerns, perhaps, that the laws are there, the standards are there, but whether the territories have the regulatory capacity and the sort of the manpower to properly oversee, in all respects, their offshore financial centres. And of course, the expenditure in those areas is a responsibility of the overseas territories themselves, rather than, for example, the British government. So potentially that could be a link that could be developed to strengthen these areas.
Does that apply to all overseas territories or just the smaller ones?
No, to the larger ones too.
Can I then move on? Has this debate led to some people calling for more support for independence of overseas territories?
Not within the Cayman Islands.
A little bit elsewhere, but it's more rhetorical than in reality.
And what about other issues like the Windrush scandal and other issues where people in the Caribbean will have felt quite rightly very angry about things which the British government have done or have not done?
Yeah. I think it is a difficult time in the relationship between the UK and its territories. So with Brexit, with the response to Hurricane Irma perhaps, with the public registries issue, but there have been difficult periods in the past around the decriminalisation of gay sex, around the end of the death penalty a few years before that. So there have been these spikes of discontent, but there hasn't been any real tangible sort of discussion about the route towards independence. I think one discussion is maybe greater autonomy and maybe looking at the Bermuda model, which Mr. Ferguson talked about before, sort of aspiring to greater levels of autonomy, but I don't think independence, certainly in the next 10, 20 years, is a possibility.
So when we see some politicians or community figures making remarks of that kind, it's more rhetoric than reality.
I think it's for the domestic political audience, yes.
Thank you.
Can I just ask very quickly before we move on, how has the Act impacted the UK standing in CARICOM and the Organisation of East Caribbean States?
I think at the last CARICOM Heads of Government meeting, there was a part in the communique which talked about, and I please don't quote me that.
We will.
Well, yes.
I'm afraid it's hands-on, so you literally will be quoted on everything you say.
Sorry, Mr. No, the statement was around voicing concern of the UK Parliament's acceptance of an amendment in legislation that doesn't take into account the constitutional relationship of the overseas territories.
Yes, that's true. And the CARICOM have been long defenders of the overseas territories when UK government has sort of shown its hand. So again, in the Turks and Caicos Islands case, CARICOM was very much opposed to what was done.
Yes, they condemned me.
Personally?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I ask about contingent liability, that phrase, just because we've not talked about it so far, but I understand that some people find it offensive as a concept, but just, I don't, where does that lie now?
I think where it was. So again, Mr. Ferguson sort of related to the fact that there's sort of a compromise position in terms of the governance arrangements in place, and there's not perhaps too much wiggle room that the UK government is prepared to give the territories at the moment. There's always a tension between sort of self-government and good government, and I think is still the case. But whether, I guess Anguilla is the obvious case because it has a constitution dating back to 1982, so whether there can be certain reforms there. There has been discussions about issues around the power to legislate, the role of the governor, for example, as well. So I think within those margins, I think there could be some further discussion, but contingent liabilities, certainly my understanding in relation to the UK government, are still very central.
From the Cayman Islands perspective, whilst that may still be a characteristic of the relationship, the history of the Cayman Islands ever since we started our own relationship directly with the UK, we've never required any money from the UK government. We've never asked for any money. In fact, during the Falklands War, we gave $1 million to the UK government in aid and in support of the UK's defence of our fellow British overseas territory.
But you would need permission for significant borrowing requirements, don't you, from the UK government?
Permission?
Yes.
Once we passed a certain threshold of borrowing, yes.
So I remember quite clearly 2009, 2010, you needed a very large amount of borrowing, and that came to the UK government, and there was a big row between the UK government and Cayman about whether that was a sensible direction to go in when you didn't have when you had a very narrow tax base.
And certainly since then we haven't borrowed any money. We've had a surplus budget since 2012. So the tax base and government model and, if you will, business model that we have of the Cayman Islands works for us.
That's an issue across the board, isn't it? So
yeah.
Anguilla, there's significant UK involvement. British Virgin Islands, there's significant involvement in relation to the hurricane reconstruction efforts. So that is a key issue that the UK is certainly watchful of.
Let alone, places like Montserrat, where it's a whole different set of equations. Yeah.
We're going to be voting very soon about exactly. So there's a few more issues that I'd like to get through, and given that when we vote we'll have to break for 15 minutes, let's try and get through it, and then we won't keep half an hour. So it would be best not to keep you waiting while we do that. Can I quickly ask, going straight on from hurricane? Sorry, no, I'm being incredibly rude. Royston, you wanted to come in on Brexit?
I want to talk about Brexit, if I may. Mr. Bush, you talked about where the UK might set its sights post-Brexit, looking for future trade deals, that sort of thing, and where it might want to put its sights. So that would be potentially, from your point of view, perhaps a risk. The UK has its eye on a different prize. But what do you see are the risks, but as importantly, the opportunities of Brexit for the overseas territories, and Cayman particularly, of course?
Thank you, sir. From the Cayman Islands perspective, we were not consulted on Brexit on the referendum. We were not given a vote, and that's fine. From the Cayman Islands perspective, we accept Brexit as a reality, and therefore look at the opportunities. We have no official ties to the European Union other than through our British nationality and who we are as British people. We do not have any direct borders, so if you will, the risks of Brexit for the Cayman Islands, as far as we have identified, are all within the global risks of what it is to be British. We do see Brexit as an opportunity to redefine our own relationship with the UK government, and as certainly under the context and flag and banner of Global Britain. And Mr. Chairman, we also thank the committee for looking to better define what that means. I would certainly ask that the overseas territories, and indeed the Crown Dependencies, fall part of that, because I think we do have a lot to offer in broadening the UK's global footprint in many different areas, whether it be biodiversity, which we make up 80% of the UK's biodiversity, whether it be financial services, whether it be around healthcare or different pockets of excellence. So from the Cayman Islands perspective, we only see it as an opportunity, and we want to have those constructive conversations about how we can help each other and be a strong part of Global Britain.
Dr. Clay?
Yes, I think that's the same for many of the territories within the Caribbean. I think some of the Caribbean territories would have potentially greater losses as a consequence of Brexit, not necessarily in terms of trade, but certainly aid. And the sort of the regional approach to aid that the EU provides, which is very useful at ranging climate change, sustainability, biodiversity, energy policy, all of those things are very important for the overseas territories at the moment.
Has there been any commitment to replace any of that funding going forward from the UK government?
I can answer that, certainly.
Sorry to interrupt.
Lord Ahmad, as the Minister for the Overseas Territories, did write to all Chief Ministers and Premiers indicating just that.
Indicating what, sorry?
Sorry, that the UK government would replace any lost funding from that is currently approved by the
Beyond 2020.
Yes.
The issue, just to say, sorry, I mean, it's also the French and the Dutch connections. So it's not just sort of bilateral aid or aid just for the UK overseas territories, which the territories appreciate. It's linking in with their French and Dutch neighbours in an effective way, dealing with these issues on a collective basis, which may well be lost in a couple of years' time.
And is there a feeling that will be lost?
I think at the moment there is that feeling, yes.
I know that Anguilla is quite concerned because it does have some funding through European development funding. I gather the government did actually issue one of these what might happen if there's no deal papers a few days ago, where it covers some of these issues, but does explicitly say that they wouldn't, the exceptions are the finance, interest, subsidies and technical assistance through the European Investment Bank's Overseas Countries and Territories Investment Facility, which are not covered by this guarantee. So some of our overseas territories will actually lose out because the British government is not prepared to fund everything. So I think, I don't know if you've made an assessment of that.
We don't request any funding from the EU.
Okay.
The Cayman Islands.
Well, we certainly, this was a letter that Alan Duncan sent to our committee just a few days ago.
Can I go on to what I think is
Sorry, can we just ask whether we could have a copy of the letter from Lord Ahmed?
Yeah.
Sure.
If there are no further questions, I was just going to finish with one, which is very much focused on Hurricane Irma and how the islands are recovering. The various islands are recovering. I'm interested, is the UK government doing enough? Excuse me. And how does it compare with the French and Dutch support in various areas?
The Cayman Islands, thankfully, was not affected by Hurricane Irma.
Perhaps I can encourage you to have your UK OTA hat on for this moment, because you're quite right. Cayman wasn't affected, but yes. others.
Hurricane Ivan was devastated. Yeah.
In 2004, we were devastated by Hurricane Ivan, and the UK's response in 2004 was minimal at best, and we were left to our own devices to rebuild, to understand what the current reality was and what we had at our disposal. And what we had at our disposal was things that we created ourselves. We didn't have any offer of assistance, whether it be financial expertise or otherwise, from the UK government back in 2004. The experience that I have heard from my fellow colleagues in other overseas territories that was affected is that there has been some assistance offered. Always, there could be more, and that's all I can really say on that, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry.
I think there was.
Go on,
Sorry, I think there was a sense that maybe the UK authorities were caught somewhat unawares initially, and that had to sort of keep responding as the situation got worse over time. That the fact that there wasn't sort of a dedicated UK presence on the individual islands, I think was a drawback, certainly when compared to the French and Dutch territories. But I think now reconstruction efforts are starting to take shape. Certainly Anguilla and the British Virgin Islands are coming back to some kind of normalcy, although there's still a lot to do. But they're also getting significant help from the Caribbean Development Bank, for example, and some technical assistance from ECLAC as well. So again, that regional perspective has been quite helpful to some of the territories.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could just explain, Cayman's response. So whilst we were lucky not to be affected by the hurricanes, a part of the global British response was Cayman was the first global British responder. We were able, the Premier led a delegation. We have our own airline. We flew a 737 jet filled with emergency personnel, 16,000 pounds of emergency aid into Anguilla, whereby we delivered that and offered emergency personnel. In the BVI, we had police officers assisting with security issues in BVI for up to 6 months after the storm. Similar in Turks and Caicos, we were able to fly in another 737 filled with doctors, medical personnel, and humanitarian aid to that. So I know there was a lot of criticism within the UK about the timeliness of the response. But if we can accept that the overseas territories form part of a global Britain, the global British response was pretty good.
Did you want to?
Well, I think just to sum up, just one final point, if I may. This is, I think, about 10 years since the Foreign Affairs Committee has actually done, under our former distinguished chairman here, a report on overseas. That's 10 years. And today's revealed there's so many areas that are relevant to the UK working with overseas territories. Do you feel that the way overseas territories are able to express their views, to be consulted, to be involved, do you feel that this is the right forum that it should continue with, or should there be a better way of, I mean, for instance, the Premier of Cayman, he comes here, he's not given VIP treatment, even coming into British Parliament.